best of all possible worlds. So basically, I would love to argue that this university, at least for your undergraduate years, is probably the best. I mean, graduate, that's a whole nother thing. But plus the tuition is basically as inexpensive as it gets, unless you have a full ride, which some people actually get here, of course, because of the way our state does. But so the thing about Steven Pinker, though, and talking about this being really the best of all possible worlds so far, points out that what happens is the media tends to focus on the disasters, on the bad news, and there's that line that with regard to the newspapers and so on, that if it bleeds, it leads. All the nice stories about cats playing with balls, chasing after laser beams, that's all fun. And there's probably an awful lot of that going on. But the news that gets published in the front page is the worst of the things that are going on. They sit around in the room and they figure out what's the worst news. How can we make it sound absolutely such a disaster that everybody's going to buy the paper so that they can read about this disaster? And you get, even on the internet, of course, you get little tidbits. Oh, you've got to read this because she, and then you don't know what it is, so you click on it, and of course, then you end up with who knows what. It was just a clickbait situation. Well, what Pinker points out, and I think he's he's a psychology professor at Harvard, and I think he's right, even though I think his wife is more brilliant than he is, by the way. You end up with people being hit with a deluge of all this bad news, and the end result psychologically is you feel like, oh my goodness, the end of the world, right? It's here any minute. Like me, well, I don't even have a watch anymore. Who does? In any case, that I think plays into this argument as well, that from the outset of the Enlightenment until 1914, the view accumulated so much evidence that the idea of progress seemed self-evident. Mankind seemed to be progressing not just economically and technologically, but as a civilized and moral species. World War I shattered that assumption. Then came the Hitlerian, Stalinist, and Maoist atrocities, etc. So disillusionment followed the world wars, etc. But a contrasting perspective of human accomplishment, an empirically appropriate perspective, I hope to persuade you, is this. Humility is an appropriate starting point. By the way, I'm the most humble person in the room. Just saying. And I'm proud of it, too. That's, I always use that. I think it's a good joke. I think it's a Woody Allen joke. The human march forward has been filled with wrong turns, backsliding, and horrible crimes, but taken in its grand sweep, it has indeed been a march forward on every dimension. What's my camera doing? It's still working. All right. Amazing. Maybe that criticism I made of the Chinese did it, All right. La Belle Epoque, the beautiful epic, the seductive. All right. So, let me move on. This is actually a Amazon or Google Books search. So it's totally a gift, however much they're giving us here. The goal of this book is to view the pageant of human accomplishment. And so he starts off looking at the span of time to be covered, sets the scene, describes the concrete but very different settings in which human accomplishment has unfolded. Since you used the word concrete, it occurred to me that I had always heard that the Romans invented concrete, and I recently read somewhere that even though the Romans didn't invent concrete, they perfected it. Which means, who invented concrete then? So I don't know. I could probably ask Google. They probably know. So a sense of time. So they said that there were 90 pages I would get. And what I wanted to do was look at the usual suspects when he picks on them are the big names that we usually hear about in history, like Da Vinci. I don't know if you've seen on the TV lately, the PBS has been playing the new special on Da Vinci, based on Walter Isaacson's book, talking about genius and so on. And by the way, Da Vinci never finished anything. Even the Mona Lisa, which I have a copy of at home, he was never finished with it. That's why he kept bringing them with him, because he kept adding to it. So he was never finished with it. That's just funny. All right. But let's see if he actually gets to these are all the subjects he's going to try to cover. This is almost as boring as reading about probability, isn't it? I don't even know how to say that name. The walls at Saxe, I don't know. Do you know how to say that? No, I don't either. I think it's Peru, right? And I know ahead of time what he's talking about is those walls. If you've ever seen the way those huge blocks fit perfectly with one another, and we have no explanation for how anyone could have done that. And it's not just there. It's the earliest pyramids in Egypt were better constructed than the later ones. So, aliens, maybe? Somebody with incredible technology. All right. How are you guys online doing? Am I boring you to death too?
I actually find this pretty interesting. There's a lot of good history in here.
I do recommend Charles Murray, and I don't mean to be making this as a critique of his method, although it certainly is. It's still interesting what he's accomplished in his book on human accomplishment. And I have a particular appreciation for Murray because one of his books that he's most famous for is The Bell Curve. He and Herrnstein wrote that. Then Herrnstein died, so Charles Murray's the only one left around for people to argue with about the book. But the book was basically an argument that because of the nature of our workplace, our technologies becoming more and more important. Notice in the United States, we used to have all kinds of industry. It's moved away because it was cheaper to find people to do those jobs, the routine jobs, sewing, you name it. There's all kinds of industries that moved either to Mexico or East Asia, China, Korea. They moved elsewhere because it was cheaper, the labor was cheaper. If you did those same things here in the United States, you had to pay the people more because we have a higher standard of living. But when all those jobs left, as Perot said, it left a great sucking sound as all these, NAFTA and other trading agreements moved all those jobs out. It left a rust belt, so-called, in the United States, where all these factories are now empty, and the people that lived in those towns that thrived because of the factory no longer have work. And that leads you to the kind of book writing that J.D. Vance wrote, Hillbilly Elegy, which, growing up in Kentucky in a community where, it was a town that had a thriving industry, but the jobs moved away to find cheaper labor. And as a result, all the people that couldn't leave with the factory, of course, ended up there with no jobs, and they're basically living, if anything, on government handouts. And basically you end up with people using drugs and other things in order to escape the misery of their environment. Children growing up in that kind of situation. J.D. Vance, luckily, getting into the Marines, then into law school, and then, so he's an exception, of course. But his book, I remember reading it back in the day to find out why were so many people interested in Trump's arguments. But what Charles Murray argues in his book, in fact, I'm gonna leave this one. I'll leave this one and go to his other book, The Bell Curve. Isn't that nice? Look at that. We get to... Who's doing this? Usually, when you look up a book, you just see the title and the price. Today, they're giving me like 90 pages of the book. So, here's a perfect argument for this. Now, this is a statistical argument. Is looking, of course, at the nature of employment in the United States and arguing that if you're going to get a job in the future, the way that the economy is moving is more and more people are going to have to get jobs that require a higher and higher education. So basically, intelligence is ascendant, as he says in this particular paragraph. Can you see it? I don't know if you're... And so the concern of the book, The Bell Curve, which is like whose IQ, what kind of intelligence do you have? What kind of job might you get in the future? And what things are relevant to trying to make sure that your children or your students, if you're a teacher, are going to be able to get because by the way, from the get-go, we know that while you have to be human, we're not talking about chimpanzees getting jobs in computer companies, right? So we're talking about humans, so you certainly have to have a certain type of genetics, and you have to be healthy. I mean, if you look at the population, say, of Alaska, for example, horrible statistic, roughly 25% of the population of Alaska have mental issues that this argument is not going to apply to. Because they're not in a situation where they're going to be able to get the kind of education and get the kind of job that will enable them to have the kind of middle class, upper middle class expectation that Americans grow up with, thinking that's what you're going to get. Well, the problem, of course, is primarily alcohol and abuse. So we have a problem in Alaska because so many parents drink alcohol, including wives who are pregnant, and as a result, we have a roughly 25% of our state population has fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And it's a spectrum